Welcome to Cognitive Dose. We are here, as always, curing blind spots, cultivating intellect, and shattering cognitive bias. And today, we are undertaking a very specific kind of intellectual exercise. We're looking at Viktor Frankl's seminal, globally renowned text, Man's Search for Meaning.
Right.
My role in this exchange is to lay out the pristine objective baseline of Frankl's thesis. I'm going to present the academic overview of his experiences in the concentration camps and the psychological framework he derived from them, which is known as logotherapy.
And my role is to act as the cynical investigator here, because once that baseline is established, I am going to rigorously cross-examine these widely accepted concepts. I mean, when a piece of philosophical literature becomes universally beloved, we sort of just stop questioning it.
We do.
Yeah, and I refuse to blindly accept superficial wisdom without dismantling it first, just to see if the underlying structure actually holds up under scrutiny.
Well, structure is actually exactly where we should begin. Usually, when we look at an ancient stone archway, we make this intuitive assumption about its stability. We assume the stones are resting gently on one another, that like a lightness of touch is the key to it staying up.
Right. You'd think you need to relieve the structural burden so it doesn't crumble.
Exactly. But an architect will tell you the exact opposite. If an architect wants to strengthen a failing arch, they actually increase the load laid upon it. They add weight. Because that heavy weight creates a structural tension that forces the stones to bind more firmly together. You save the structure not by removing stress, but by actively utilizing it. And Frankl uses a very similar concept, which he calls neural dynamics, to explain human mental health. But before we get to the clinical theory, we really have to establish the crucible in which it was forged.
Yeah, the context is everything here.
Right. Frankl was a prominent psychiatrist in Vienna before he was deported to the Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz.
And his background is crucial. I mean, he didn't enter the camps as a layman. He entered as a highly trained observer of the human mind, watching behavior at the absolute limits of physical and psychological endurance.
Precisely. He was stripped of everything. His life's work, a manuscript he had actually sewn into this coat, was confiscated. His identity was literally reduced to a number. And in this environment of total deprivation, Frankl observed a tragic, reoccurring phenomenon among his fellow prisoners. He details the descent of the Muslims, which was the camp slang for prisoners who had completely lost all hope.
Yeah, the physical manifestation of that psychological collapse is one of the most famous observations in the book.
It really is. Frankl noted that you could predict almost to the day when a man was going to die. The prisoner would simply refuse to get up for roll call. He would lie in his own filth in the barracks, and the ultimate telltale sign, he would pull out his hidden emergency ration of cigarettes and smoke them.
Right, because normally cigarettes were used as currency.
Exactly. You traded them for an extra bowl of watery soup to prolong your life. The moment a man smoked his own cigarettes, it meant he had entirely given up on the future. Once that internal meaning vanished, physical death followed within days. Frankl observed that the sudden loss of hope directly lowered their physiological immunity, leading them to just succumb to typhus or starvation.
So the foundation of his entire thesis essentially rests on this psychosomatic connection, that the presence or absence of a future-oriented goal dictates physical survival.
Yes, and this leads us to the core of logotherapy. Frankl leans heavily on a quote from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche: "He who has a why to live for can bear with almost any how."
Right.
Frankl explicitly contrasts his new framework with the prevailing psychological dogmas of his era. He completely pivots away from Sigmund Freud's idea that humans are driven by a will to pleasure. He also rejects Alfred Adler's theory of a will to power. Instead, Frankl posits that the primary fundamental drive of the human psyche is the will to meaning.
And unlike psychoanalysis, which generally looks backward into the patient's past, to unearth repressed drives and childhood traumas, Logotherapy looks strictly forward. It focuses entirely on the meanings to be fulfilled by the patient in their future.
That is the key distinction. It's fundamentally future-oriented, and Frankl outlines 3 distinct practical avenues through which any human being can find this meaning. The first is by creating a work or doing a deed, like an external contribution to the world.
Okay.
The second is by experiencing something or encountering someone, which he distills primarily down to the experience of profound love. But it's the third avenue that is the most crucial, especially in the context of the camps. Meaning can be found in the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering.
This is where his idea of the last of human freedoms comes in, right? The idea that even when every physical and material freedom is stripped away, the individual retains the ultimate autonomy to choose how they respond to their suffering.
Yes, and this brings us right back to our architectural metaphor. Frankl argued that mental health requires a specific load-bearing tension, not the complete absence of stress, which he believed actually led to psychological decay, but rather the tension between what one is and what one ought to accomplish. The will to meaning is that stabilizing weight pressing down on the archway of the human mind, keeping us structurally sound.
All right. So that is the pristine, objective, widely accepted baseline of Frankl's theory. It sounds beautiful. I mean, it sounds incredibly noble.
It is?
And now we are going to tear it down. Because when you actually transition this philosophy from an inspirational memoir into a rigid, clinical doctrine, it becomes a deeply problematic framework.
Okay, let's hear it.
My first major critique begins right where your foundation does, with the story of the Moslems. I argue that Frankl's framing of these deaths edges dangerously close to toxic survivor bias and implicit victim blaming.
Victim blaming? I mean, he is merely documenting this psychosomatic collapse of individuals in extreme conditions. He isn't blaming them, he's just diagnosing the mechanics of their physical deterioration.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let's look closely at the mechanism he is proposing. By claiming that a sudden loss of hope led to lowered immunity and death, Frankl is heavily implying that those who perished simply lacked the requisite will to meaning. He is inadvertently weaponizing his own survival.
How so?
We cannot ignore his relative privilege within the camp hierarchy. He was a doctor. Because of that, he occasionally secured indoor work away from the freezing mud. He was occasionally granted an extra scoop of peas from the bottom of the soup vat because a capo happened to like him. He takes the sheer, chaotic luck of his survival and constructs a paradigm where surviving a genocide somehow becomes a measure of individual psychological fortitude.
I'm going to push back on that immediately because you were ignoring his explicit written caveats. Frankl is incredibly clear about the brutal, arbitrary self-selection of survival in the camps. He explicitly states in the text, and I quote, "We know the best of us did not return."
He does say that, but
He openly acknowledges that survival often required losing all scruples and that the most moral, gentle prisoners often perished first. He is absolutely not claiming that the virtuous or the strong survived while the weak died.
He says the best didn't return, yes, but his overarching clinical thesis contradicts that polite caveat. The very foundation of logotherapy diagnoses the dead as having succumbed to an inner psychological failure. Take his example of the death rate spiking between Christmas 1944 and New Year's 1945.
Right.
Frankl notes that the mortality rate didn't spike because of worse weather or a lack of food. He claims it spiked because prisoners had naively hoped to be liberated and home by Christmas. When Christmas came and went, they lost hope, their immunity dropped, and they died. Do you see what he's doing there? He is turning a systemic, industrialized genocide into a failure of psychological resilience.
No, he is observing that among those who weren't immediately sent to the gas chambers, the internal narrative was the only variable they could actually control.
Suddenly absolves the actual perpetrators of the immediate physical deaths. The SS, the gas chambers, the typhus-infected lice, the systemic starvation, those are what killed people, not an existential vacuum. If you tell a starving, freezing, brutally abused person that their physical survival hinges on their ability to manifest an internal why, you are placing an impossible, grotesque burden squarely on the shoulders of the victim.
That's a profound misreading of his intent. Frankl isn't placing a burden. He is identifying the absolute last refuge of human autonomy. When they take your clothes, your family, your hair, and your name, the only thing the guards cannot touch is the attitude you choose to adopt toward that suffering. That is not victim blaming. That is profoundly empowering. It's about maintaining agency in an entirely agency-less environment.
Then let's look at how that so-called agency is actually applied in his psychiatric practice after the war. Because this brings me to my second major attack on the material, what I call therapeutic authoritarianism. We have to ask a very uncomfortable question about logotherapy. Who exactly gets to define this meaning?
Oh, well, Frankl is clear that the patient defines it. The meaning of life is entirely unique and specific to the individual at any given moment. The therapist doesn't supply it.
Oh, really? Let's look at the actual text. Let's look at the famous example of the elderly, grieving rabbi from Eastern Europe. This rabbi lost his first wife and his 6 children in Auschwitz. His second wife is sterile. The rabbi comes to Frankl in absolute despair because he has no son to say Kaddish for him when he dies. He is suffering deeply, trapped in an agonizing grief. And what does Frankl do?
He helps the rabbi find a profound meaning in his immense, unavoidable suffering.
No, he dictates the meaning to him. Frankl tells the grieving rabbi that his murdered children died as innocent martyrs, and therefore they occupy the highest possible place in heaven. But the rabbi, being an old, sinful man, couldn't expect to naturally reach that same elevated place. So Frankl tells him that his survival and the agonizing suffering he is experiencing now is the very purification process required so he can eventually join his children in heaven.
They gave him peace.
Do you see how manipulative that is, though? Frankl feeds this vulnerable man a highly specific manufactured theological justification for the Holocaust that strips the patient of their autonomy entirely. It forces the individual to comply with the therapist's ideological framework.
You are completely ignoring Frankl's own definition of his methodology. He explicitly addresses this exact concern using the analogy of vision. He says a logotherapist is an eye specialist, not a painter. A painter tries to convey a picture of the world exactly as the painter sees it. But an ophthalmologist simply tries to enable the patient to see the world as it really is.
I disagree.
Frankl is simply broadening the patient's visual field so they can see the whole spectrum of potential meaning. He knew the rabbi was an Orthodox Jew. He used the rabbi's own existing belief system to broaden his visual field. He wasn't painting a new picture. He was helping the rabbi see the logical endpoint of his own faith.
That eye doctor analogy is nothing but a clever rhetorical trick to mask what is actually happening in the clinical setting. When you tell a grieving father that his 6 children were murdered in a gas chamber, specifically so that he could be purified by the pain of their absence, you are not checking his vision. You are painting a deeply specific, highly prescriptive, and frankly disturbing picture, and he does this constantly. Look at the example of the American diplomat.
The high-ranking American diplomat who came to Frankl because he was profoundly dissatisfied with his career.
Exactly. This diplomat had been in psychoanalysis for 5 years in New York. The Freudian analyst was convinced the diplomat's dissatisfaction with the U.S. government was just unresolved anger toward his father, treating the government as a symbolic father image. Frankl steps in, listens for a bit, and decides the man isn't suffering from unresolved trauma at all. He diagnoses him with existential frustration, tells the diplomat his will to meaning is being thwarted by his vocation, and essentially steers him to quit his job.
And he did.
Right. The diplomat quits, and Frankl points to this as a massive success. In both cases, the rabbi and the diplomat, Frankl is acting as an absolute authority figure, demanding compliance to his own diagnosis of what their life's meaning should be.
But the diplomat was happy after he quit. Frankl's intervention broke the endless, retrospective cycle of psychoanalysis that was keeping the man trapped in the past. Psychoanalysis looks backward at drives and instincts. Logotherapy pulls the patient forward. The tension Frankl introduced wasn't authoritarian. It was liberating. He freed the diplomat from seeing the forest of reality through the confusing trees of Freudian symbols. What you are calling therapeutic authoritarianism is actually just active, directive therapy aimed at pulling people out of the existential vacuum.
Well, let's talk about that existential vacuum, because it perfectly sets up my third and most fundamental critique of this entire philosophy. Frankl diagnoses the modern age with this pervasive emptiness, a private form of nihilism. He claims that because human beings lack animal instincts to tell us exactly what to do, and because we've lost traditional societal structures to guide us, we fall into a void. We experience the Sunday neurosis, that depression that hits when the busy work week stops and people realize how empty their lives actually are. And his ultimate solution to this vacuum is a concept he calls tragic optimism.
Yes, the ability to maintain optimism in the face of the tragic triad: pain, guilt, and death. It's the highest human capacity to creatively turn life's unavoidable negative aspects into something constructive.
I could end this framework completely. I argue that tragic optimism acts as a massive philosophical tranquilizer for society. By demanding that suffering be transformed into a human achievement and asking individuals to be worthy of their sufferings, Frankl romanticizes severe trauma. It imposes a kind of toxic positivity on the most vulnerable people in society. It shifts the burden of coping entirely onto the victim while allowing oppressive, unjust systems to operate unchecked.
That argument willfully ignores one of the most vital, explicitly stated caveats in the entire book. Frankl is adamant that meaning is only to be found in unavoidable suffering. He explicitly writes, if it were avoidable, the meaningful thing to do would be to remove its cause, be it psychological, biological, or political. To suffer unnecessarily is masochistic rather than heroic.
Sure, he says that, but
He is absolutely not telling people to sit back and accept systemic injustice. If you can change the political system, changing it is the meaningful act. Tragic optimism only applies when you are facing a fate you absolutely cannot alter, like an inoperable cancer or being trapped in a concentration camp.
that caveat is completely overshadowed by the macro impact of his philosophy. Think about the societal implications of telling people their primary ultimate power is their internal attitude. When an entire philosophy is built on the premise that the last of human freedoms is merely choosing one's attitude toward oppression, it inevitably breeds complacency. It tells marginalized people, the unemployed, the disenfranchised, to look inward to find nobility in their pain, rather than to rage against the machine that causes it.
But he explicitly addresses the unemployed in the text. He talks about his clinical studies on unemployment neurosis. He found that jobless individuals equated being jobless with being useless, and being useless with having a meaningful life. They were deeply depressed. When he got them to volunteer, to engage in unpaid but meaningful activity for their community, their depression completely disappeared.
They were still unemployed, though.
They were still hungry, they were still poor, but they had their meaning back. That isn't a tranquilizer. That is giving someone their human dignity back when the socioeconomic system has completely failed them. It proves his point that man does not live by welfare alone.
Are you not seeing the immense danger in that exact phrase? Man does not live by welfare alone is exactly the kind of rhetoric that gets weaponized by the state to avoid fixing poverty. It allows society to say, we don't need to provide you with jobs or housing or food. You just need to go volunteer and find your internal meaning. It is the ultimate shifting of responsibility from the collective to the individual. Just like in the concentration camps, where the horrific systemic violence of the SS is overshadowed by the internal psychological battle of the prisoner, the failure of the modern state is overshadowed by the unemployed person's failure to find a fulfilling hobby.
I think you are taking a philosophy meant to save the individual sitting in a psychiatric clinic and unfairly demanding it solve macroeconomic policy. Frankl is fighting the deterministic view that human beings are nothing but the product of their environment. He's fighting nothing butness. We have to hold both truths simultaneously. We must acknowledge the profound resilience of the human spirit that Frankl champions, while refusing to romanticize the tragedy.
No, we don't. We do not have to harmonize these viewpoints. We need to look at what this philosophy actually does when implemented at scale. By insisting that we must answer life's questions by answering for our own lives, Logotherapy leaves practically zero room for acknowledging how deeply our lives are sometimes shattered by forces completely outside our control.
The demand to be worthy of your suffering is an unbearable, crushing weight to place on someone already broken by the world. It is a brilliant coping mechanism disguised as a universal truth. To everyone listening, use this exact discomfort. Take the intellectual friction we've generated today and use it to build your own mental immunity against universally accepted dogmas. Never accept a comforting philosophy without first checking to see who it inadvertently absolves. Subscribe to Cognitive Dose.